John lay unconscious in the sterile hospital room, his body hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically, the only sound marking the passage of time. Once a powerful millionaire with an empire built on ambition and ruthless decisions, now he was just another patient, lying motionless in a bed, his future uncertain. His family had all but disappeared in the wake of the accident that had left him in a coma, too consumed by their own lives, their wealth, their business, to offer more than a few perfunctory visits, a fleeting moment of concern before they returned to their carefully curated worlds. His father, distant and cold, hadn't even bothered to show up, and his siblings had better things to do, like vacationing in far-off destinations or attending social events. John had always been the one who gave, who worked, who led, but now, in his most vulnerable state, there was no one to give him the care or attention he desperately needed. The room was quiet, save for the faint sounds of the machines and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's footsteps in the hallway. Yet, amidst this indifferent world of wealth and power, there was one person who saw him for who he truly was, beyond the name, beyond the fortune, beyond the reputation. Emily, a kind-hearted maid employed by the family, had been the one to stay by his side, day after day, while others came and went. She had never seen him as the millionaire, the business tycoon, or the heir to a vast fortune. She had simply seen him as a man in need, vulnerable, fragile, and human. Her role in the household had always been to keep things running smoothly, to tend to the needs of the family, but in the quiet hours of the night, she found herself drawn to John's bedside, offering him comfort in ways the rest of his family could not. Emily would sit by him for hours, her hand gently resting on his, her voice soft and comforting as she spoke to him, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. She talked about the weather, about her family, about her day, anything to fill the silence, to let him know that someone cared. There were times when she would look at him, her heart heavy with the tenderness she had never expected to feel for someone so distant, so unreachable. She couldn't help but wonder if John, in his coma, could somehow hear her, could feel the warmth of her presence, the love she was quietly offering. Emily had seen his family's neglect, the way they came in only to fulfill their obligations before leaving without a second thought. It angered her, but it also saddened her. She saw a man who had given so much to the world, only to find himself abandoned when he needed love and support the most. And while she wasn't family, she felt it was her duty, her privilege to care for him, to give him the attention and kindness his own blood had failed to provide. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. John's condition never seemed to improve, but Emily's devotion never wavered. She knew it wasn't enough, not for someone like him, someone who had always been surrounded by luxury and people who had never truly cared. But she still did it because someone had to. She couldn't let him be alone, not in this state. There were moments, small moments, when she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, or felt a slight pressure on her hand as if he were trying to communicate. But then, just as quickly, the moments would fade, leaving her heart aching with the uncertainty of it all. But Emily was determined. She found solace in the quiet moments she shared with John. Sometimes, she would read to him from books she knew he had loved, or play soft music in the background. It wasn't much, but it was everything to her. As the days passed, Emily began to notice small changes, his pulse becoming slightly steadier, his breathing less labored, the faintest color returning to his cheeks. She couldn't be sure if these changes were signs of recovery or just the natural ebb and flow of life, but to her, they were hope. She started to believe that perhaps, against all odds, John could wake up. Perhaps he could emerge from the dark, silent abyss of his coma and see the world again. Emily knew she couldn't do this alone. She wasn't a doctor, and she couldn't work miracles. But she could care. She could offer him her heart, her kindness, and her unwavering belief that he deserved more than the emptiness of his family's neglect. She believed that love, however small or quiet, had the power to heal, to bring someone back from the edge of despair. Emily didn't expect anything in return. She wasn't looking for recognition, wasn't hoping for some grand reward for her loyalty. She simply wanted to give John the one thing his wealth and power had never been able to buy: human connection, love, and the knowledge that he was worth caring for. As the weeks stretched on, John's condition remained fragile, but Emily's love never faltered. And though his family continued their lives without him, she remained steadfast, knowing that sometimes, it was the quiet, unseen gestures, the ones given without expectation, that made the greatest difference in a world that often forgot the power of kindness. As the days slowly turned into weeks, Emily's unwavering dedication to John became a quiet force in a world filled with uncertainty. He had been in a coma for what seemed like forever, lying motionless in the sterile hospital bed, his body hooked up to monitors that beeped and hummed in the background. But to Emily, he was never just a patient, never just another case on the ward. He was John, someone she had known long before the accident that had left him in this lifeless state. They had shared countless moments, laughs, and dreams, and she couldn't bear to believe that any of that was lost. So, she stayed. Every day, without fail, Emily arrived at the hospital with a quiet resolve, her footsteps echoing in the sterile hallways, her heart a mix of hope and sorrow. While others had given up, suggesting that John might never wake up, Emily refused to let go. She believed in him. She believed in the power of love, the power of connection, and the power of her voice to reach him when no one else could. She would sit by his side for hours, her hand resting gently on his, speaking to him as though he could hear her, as though the world outside could vanish and only the two of them existed in that small, quiet space. She spoke of everything and nothing at all, of memories they had shared, of future plans that she still hoped could come to pass, of her belief that his spirit was still alive somewhere, even if his body didn't yet show it. She spoke about the sun rising every morning, the smell of rain in the air, the sound of the birds singing outside the window, the little things that had always brought them comfort. Some days, her words flowed freely, and other days, they were nothing more than a soft murmur, a gentle plea to the universe to bring him back to her. But she never stopped. She read to him, even when she wasn't sure if he could hear. She would pick up his favorite books, the ones they used to read together, and she would voice each word with tenderness, as if each sentence carried with it a thread of hope. Her voice, soft yet steadfast, would fill the room, and in those moments, she believed that somehow, someway, it might be the key to waking him up, to drawing him back to the life they had once shared. There were days when the weight of it all became too much for her, when her exhaustion crept in, when the tears threatened to fall, when the doubts of others whispered in her ear, urging her to let go. "He's not coming back, Emily," they would say, their voices filled with pity. "You've done all you can. You need to move on." But Emily couldn't. She couldn't leave him. The love she had for John was so deeply ingrained in her that it wasn't just something she felt, it was a part of her, a part of who she was. She couldn't give up on him, not when there was even the slightest chance that he might hear her voice, that he might find his way back to her. So, she stayed. Even when the others had gone home for the night, and the hospital room became quiet and still, Emily would remain, sitting by his side, talking, reading, and holding his hand. The nurses would often find her there, long after her shift had ended, her eyes tired but full of love. They would offer her sympathy, but Emily never needed it. She wasn't waiting for anyone else's approval. She was waiting for John. She was waiting for the moment when he would squeeze her hand, when his eyes would flutter open, when his voice would call her name, and everything would return to the way it was before. But as time passed, Emily found herself not just hoping for John to wake up, but discovering a quiet strength within herself. She realized that even if he never woke up, she had still found something valuable in these moments she spent with him, something that transcended the fear, the uncertainty, and the pain. It was love. A love that didn't demand anything in return, a love that simply gave, without hesitation or doubt. And as she cared for him, as she continued to sit by his side day after day, Emily came to understand that her devotion was not just about waking him up, it was about showing him, in her own quiet way, that he was loved. That he was remembered. That he mattered. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the room, Emily spoke to him once more, her voice soft and steady. She told him she loved him, as she always did, but this time, there was a new certainty in her heart, a peace she hadn't felt before. It was as though, in caring for him, she had healed parts of herself she hadn't even realized were broken. And then, as if in response to all the love and devotion she had poured into him, something shifted. John's fingers twitched. At first, it was so slight that Emily wasn't sure if it had really happened. But then it happened again, and this time, Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what it meant, but it was enough. It was enough to remind her that love, even in its quietest form, could be powerful. And so, with a smile on her face, Emily took his hand in hers once more, knowing that whatever the future held, she had never truly given up. She had never stopped believing in the power of her love. Emily's days were punctuated by quiet moments spent beside John, moments that most would overlook as insignificant, yet to her, they were everything. John hadn't spoken in over a year. A car accident had left him unresponsive, his body lingering in a state of stillness that seemed to carry an insurmountable weight of sadness. Yet, despite his silence, Emily felt a connection to him that no one else seemed to notice. The doctors and nurses came and went, their visits clinical and impersonal, treating him as though he were a body, not a person. But Emily, she saw more. She saw the small, almost imperceptible shifts in his expression when she entered the room, the subtle way his hand would relax slightly when she held it. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her. The bond she shared with John was not one of words, but of actions, of small gestures that spoke volumes in their quiet simplicity. She would sit by his side every day, reading to him, humming softly, even just holding his hand for hours, never expecting anything in return. The world seemed to forget about him, his friends, his family, they had all distanced themselves, too uncomfortable with the gravity of his condition to visit. But Emily stayed. She was there in the mornings when the room was still dark, there in the evenings when the hospital lights cast long shadows across the sterile walls. She would gently adjust the pillow beneath his head or make sure the blanket was tucked in around his feet. These small acts of care, done with tenderness, became her way of loving him, her way of holding on to hope in a world that seemed to have let him go. It was a quiet, lonely existence, yet it was also one of profound connection. Emily didn't need John to speak for their bond to be real. She could feel his presence with her. There was something unspoken between them, something that reached past the silence. The subtle movements in his fingers, the way his eyelids fluttered when she spoke, all told her that he knew she was there. Sometimes, Emily would talk to him about her day, her thoughts, her dreams. She knew he couldn't respond, but it felt comforting, like she was still sharing parts of herself with someone who would listen. On rare occasions, when she would ask him questions she knew had no answer, she'd feel a brief moment of stillness, a pause in the room, as if John were considering her words, giving her the quiet reassurance that he understood more than anyone could see. Those moments sustained her. It was hard, so hard, to keep giving and giving with no recognition, no sign that what she was doing mattered. Her friends would occasionally tell her to move on, to stop wasting her time on someone who wasn't capable of responding. "He's gone, Emily," they would say, "let him go." But they didn't understand. They didn't see what she saw. She had come to believe that love wasn't always about grand gestures or reciprocation. Sometimes, love was in the quiet moments, those moments where you gave everything you had to someone who couldn't give anything back, but you did it because you believed in the power of your actions, even without recognition. Emily didn't need John to thank her. She didn't need him to wake up, to speak, to acknowledge what she was doing. What mattered to her was the belief that, in some way, her presence was making a difference, that the love she poured into him was still valuable, still worth giving. Even when the world moved on and left him behind, she remained. Her heart was full, not with the expectation of anything in return, but with the quiet certainty that what she was doing mattered. Slowly, the days turned into weeks, then into months. Emily found herself growing more accustomed to the rhythms of this life of caring for John in silence, of filling the space with her voice, even if it was never heard. She began to notice small things that comforted her, the way the light in the room seemed warmer when she played his favorite songs, the way his hands seemed to respond just a little more when she spoke his name. These moments, though small, were powerful for Emily. They reminded her that love could be subtle, that sometimes, even without words or grand declarations, love could thrive in the quiet, unspoken spaces between two souls. She never expected miracles. She never expected John to suddenly open his eyes or speak her name. She didn't need that to validate the bond they shared. What mattered was that she was there, that she showed up every day, loving him in the only way she knew how. And on some days, when she was alone with him in the quiet of the room, she would close her eyes and whisper to him softly, "I'm not giving up on you. I'm here. Always." It was in those moments, when the room was still and the only sound was her soft breath mingling with his, that she felt it, the bond, the connection, the silent promise. And in her heart, she knew that as long as she was there, as long as she loved him, he wasn't alone. And that was enough. John had been in the hospital for weeks now, and the silence in his room spoke volumes. His family, who had once been a constant presence in his life, had remained notably absent since his admission. His wife, who had grown weary of the challenges of caregiving, had not been seen for days. His adult children, wrapped up in their own lives and responsibilities, had sent no flowers, made no phone calls. In this sea of neglect, Emily, the nurse who had taken on the role of his constant companion, had been the only one by his side. She had watched over him with a dedication that went beyond her job description. She administered his medications with precision, but she also listened to him, comforted him when the pain became too much to bear, and offered him quiet companionship when the loneliness seemed unbearable. She saw how John's eyes would brighten when she entered the room, how he seemed to hold onto her presence as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in the face of his illness. Despite the emotional toll it took on her, Emily never wavered in her care. She gave him the kind of attention and kindness that should have come from his own family, but instead, she became the one person he could rely on. It wasn't a responsibility she took lightly, and yet, she never imagined that her bond with John would evolve into something that would impact her so deeply. Then, one day, as Emily entered John's room with the usual efficiency of someone who had seen this routine countless times before, she was surprised to see a man standing by the window. He was tall, with dark hair and an expression of quiet determination. His suit, though somewhat disheveled from travel, spoke of wealth and importance, yet there was something in his demeanor that told Emily he wasn't here just because of his title or status. His eyes, focused on John, were filled with concern and tenderness. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "You must be Emily," he said, his voice soft but filled with a warmth that immediately put her at ease. "I'm Tom, John's son." Emily nodded, offering him a smile. She had heard John speak of his children occasionally, but none had visited him in the hospital before. She had assumed that his family was too busy, too distant, to care for him in his time of need. But Tom's presence here, his quiet strength and deep care for his father, instantly shifted that perception. It became clear to Emily that Tom was different. He wasn't here to fulfill an obligation, he was here because he genuinely cared. "I've heard so much about you," she said softly. Tom's face softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I owe you a great deal," he replied, stepping closer to John's bed. He looked at his father, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and his gaze lingered on him with a mix of love and sorrow. "I haven't been the best son." "I know that," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But I've been hearing how you've taken such good care of him. I can never thank you enough for what you've done." Emily felt her heart warm at his words. She hadn't expected gratitude. Her role, after all, was to care for the patients, not to seek recognition. But Tom's words spoke to something deeper, something beyond just professional duty. They spoke to the quiet humanity that Emily had always known was there, even if it was rarely acknowledged. Tom didn't just see the nurse who cared for his father. He saw the person behind the uniform, the woman who had given of herself without expectation, who had stepped into the role of family when his own had not. As she watched Tom stand there, silently tending to his father, Emily felt a sense of connection, a bond that transcended the walls of the hospital room. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared concern for John's well-being, a mutual respect for the love that had been missing in his life for so long. The two of them, in their own way, were each trying to make up for what had been lacking, each trying to provide a sense of comfort to a man who had been abandoned by the very people who should have been there for him. Over the course of the next few hours, as Tom sat by his father's side and Emily continued her duties, an unexpected friendship blossomed between them. Their conversations, though quiet, were filled with understanding and mutual respect. Emily learned of Tom's life, the pressures of his career, the weight of his family's expectations, the struggles that had kept him from being the kind of son he had wanted to be. And Tom learned of Emily's own journey, the sacrifices she had made to become the compassionate nurse she was, the emotional toll of caring for others, and the quiet strength she had built in the face of adversity. In the midst of all this, one thing became undeniably clear to both of them: they were not so different after all. They were both trying to navigate lives that often pulled them in different directions, trying to find balance and meaning in a world that often seemed to forget the importance of the simple, human connections that bound them together. By the time the day came to an end, there was no longer any distance between them. They had forged a bond, not because of titles or roles, but because of their shared compassion for John. As Emily left the room that evening, her heart felt lighter, her spirit renewed. She had known, for some time now, that the work she did as a nurse was about more than just medical care. It was about showing people they mattered, that they were seen and loved, even when it felt like no one else was there. And today, in that small hospital room, she had witnessed that very same care come full circle from the deep, quiet affection of a son for his father, to the deep, quiet appreciation of a nurse for a patient. It was a moment of healing, for both John and for them all. Emily's heart had always been her greatest strength, but in recent months, it had also become her greatest burden. She had thrown herself into helping David, a man who had once been full of ambition and life, but now found himself lost, trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and stagnation. To anyone who looked at their relationship from the outside, Emily's dedication seemed misguided, even foolish. Why was she so committed to a man who hadn't shown any real progress, a man who, despite her unwavering support, continued to retreat further into his own world of bitterness and despair? The questions were whispered behind her back, questions about her judgment, her self-worth, and why she was pouring so much of herself into someone who, in their eyes, didn't deserve it. But Emily didn't care about their doubts. She loved David, and in her heart, she believed that love, time, and patience would eventually lead him back to the person he once was. She would do anything to help him find his way again, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness in the process. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, her efforts seemed to go unnoticed, and the cracks in her faith began to show. There were moments when her own exhaustion crept in, when the weight of carrying David's emotional burdens, along with her own, felt unbearable. But she never let anyone see it. She hid her doubts, her fears, and her weariness behind a smile, determined to keep up the appearance of the supportive partner. She believed, deep down, that if she could just be patient enough, persistent enough, the man she loved would eventually come back to life. But as her efforts went unrecognized, she began to wonder if anyone else saw her struggle, or if anyone truly understood the depth of her commitment. It was Tom, of all people, who began to see Emily in a new light. Tom had always admired her work ethic, her kindness, and her ability to stay calm in the face of adversity. He had never questioned her loyalty to David. He had simply assumed that it was just another part of her nature to take on responsibility for others. But recently, as he observed her from a distance, he started to notice something different. He saw the way Emily would spend hours on the phone, trying to comfort David, only for him to remain distant and unresponsive. He saw the weariness in her eyes as she moved through the office, always putting the needs of others before her own, but never asking for anything in return. What struck Tom most, however, was the quiet resilience she carried with her. No matter how many times David's attempts at change fell short, no matter how many times she was left alone to pick up the pieces, Emily never gave up. There was a depth to her care that went beyond obligation, beyond mere duty. It was rooted in something far more profound. At first, Tom had misunderstood her actions. He assumed that Emily was simply doing what she thought was right, but over time, he began to realize that it was more than that. She wasn't just helping David out of a sense of responsibility, she was doing it because she believed in him, even when he no longer believed in himself. She was fighting for him when he had long given up the fight. Slowly, Tom started to see Emily not as someone caught in a relationship of one-sided effort, but as a woman with an unyielding strength that came from a deep, unshakable love. It wasn't just about saving David, it was about the quiet, selfless sacrifice she made every single day. The more Tom observed, the more he began to understand the depth of her heart. He realized that the questions others had asked about her commitment, questions about why she was so dedicated to a man who seemed unable or unwilling to change, were irrelevant. The answer wasn't about whether or not David was improving, it was about the love that Emily had to give, a love that didn't ask for anything in return. It wasn't about fixing someone or expecting them to meet certain milestones. It was about being there, standing beside someone, even when the world around them didn't seem to understand. Tom felt a growing sense of admiration for Emily, a recognition that he hadn't fully grasped before. He began to realize that what she was doing was not only incredibly brave but also incredibly rare. It was easy to love someone when they were strong, when they were at their best, but to love someone through their darkest moments, when they had nothing left to give, required a depth of character that he hadn't truly appreciated until now. It wasn't just that Emily was holding David together, she was also quietly holding herself together in the process. And in that, Tom saw something that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. He saw a love that was not dependent on the other person's ability to change, but rather a love that gave and gave, expecting nothing in return. As time went on, Emily's strength began to shine through even brighter, and Tom found himself offering her more than just admiration. He found himself offering his support, understanding, and encouragement in ways he hadn't before. For the first time, he saw her not as a woman simply stuck in an unbalanced relationship, but as a person who had found a way to keep going, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. And in that realization, Tom also came to understand that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply to believe in them when no one else does. Emily's journey was one of unwavering commitment, but it was also one of quiet self-discovery. She hadn't just been fighting for David, she had been fighting for herself, too, and in that struggle, she had found a new sense of strength that she hadn't known was there. Tom may have begun to see her differently, but it was Emily who had changed the most. She had learned that love, true love, isn't always about fixing someone else, sometimes, it's about fixing yourself along the way. The hospital room was still, save for the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor that seemed to mark the passage of time with every slow, steady pulse. Emily stood at John's bedside, her hands trembling as she adjusted the oxygen mask over his face. For weeks now, she had been living in this space between hope and despair, a place where every moment felt like it could be the one that either broke her or gave her the strength to keep fighting. John had been in a coma for days, ever since the accident, an unexpected, violent collision that had shattered their lives in a single instant. The doctors had done their best, but there were no promises, no guarantees. It's a waiting game, they'd said. His body needs to heal before we can know if he'll ever wake up. Each day, Emily had poured her heart and soul into the effort, sitting by his side, talking to him, hoping that somehow he could hear her. She'd whispered his name so many times, brushing the back of his hand with her fingertips, as if love itself might be enough to bring him back. But as the days wore on, her optimism began to erode under the weight of exhaustion, the heavy burden of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. She had to take breaks if only to keep her sanity, but every time she left the room, a small, quiet part of her wondered if she'd come back to find him slipping further away. Today, as she stepped outside for a brief moment of respite, the silence felt even more suffocating than usual. She paced the empty hallway, running her fingers through her hair, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside her. Tom, John's best friend and the person who had become her anchor through this ordeal, was waiting in the waiting room. He was always there, always supporting, but Emily could see the exhaustion in his eyes too, the shared grief, the shared worry. He'll wake up, Tom had told her countless times. He's strong, Em. You know he is. But even Tom, for all his conviction, had begun to look like a man worn down by the weight of it all. It wasn't easy for either of them, but they had made it this far together. Emily knew that if there was any chance of John coming back to them, it would be because they refused to give up, refused to let him go, even when the world seemed to tell them it was time. She leaned against the wall for a moment, her thoughts racing, and then, after what seemed like an eternity, she returned to John's room, hoping for a brief moment of peace. The soft murmur of the machines greeted her as she walked back in, but something was different, something subtle, yet unmistakable. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. John's eyes slightly open, just enough to show the faintest glimmer of recognition, were fixed on the ceiling above him. Not fully awake, but the smallest of signs. The faintest trace of life that she hadn't seen before. It was as if, in that single moment, the world held its breath, as though time itself had paused to take in the weight of what she had just witnessed. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment, she stood frozen, unsure if this was real or just a fleeting illusion. But the longer she stared at him, the clearer it became, the small movement in his eyelids, the subtle flutter of his lashes, the soft rise and fall of his chest. He was still with her. He hadn't given up. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she grasped his, as if she might hold on to the moment for fear of losing it. "John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "John, can you hear me?" There was no immediate response, but she didn't need one. The fact that his eyes had opened, even just a fraction, was enough. Tom, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, heard Emily's voice crack and rushed in to join her. His face lit up with a cautious hope, a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel in days. Together, they stood there, their hands hovering over John's body, sharing the space between hope and disbelief. Neither of them dared to speak again, unsure if words could somehow break the fragile thread of connection they had just witnessed. The minutes stretched on, and though John's eyes remained only slightly open, his breath seemed steadier, more purposeful. The small sign of life was everything. It was the thread that would pull them back from the abyss, the light at the end of a dark, endless tunnel. Emily could feel her heart swell with a combination of relief and gratitude, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted, if only for a moment. She looked at Tom, their eyes meeting in a silent understanding. There was still a long road ahead, still many unknowns, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the future no longer felt completely dark. There was a chance. A real chance. And in that moment, as she held John's hand, as Tom stood beside her, Emily allowed herself to believe that, despite everything, they might just make it through this together. There was hope again, small, fragile, but real. And that was all she needed to keep going. John's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the curtains, his mind heavy and fogged, as if it were still wrapped in a distant, unfamiliar dream. He tried to move, but his body felt foreign, unresponsive, as though he were trapped in a shell he no longer recognized. It wasn't until his gaze shifted to the figure standing beside him that reality began to set in. There, watching over him with a quiet, patient tenderness, was Emily. He knew her, of course, he did. She had worked for him for years, a fixture in his home, always there, quietly tending to his needs, never asking for more than what was required of her. She had always been the maid, the one who kept the house running smoothly, who folded the laundry, prepared the meals, and cleaned the rooms. To him, she had always been just that, an employee. But as his mind began to clear, something in her presence felt different. There was a profound warmth in her eyes, a kind of gentle love that transcended any professional obligation. For the first time, John saw her not just as a maid, but as something far more important, someone who had been there for him in ways he had never fully understood. As the days passed and John's strength slowly returned, he began to learn more about what had happened, how he had ended up in this state, and why Emily had never left his side. The story unfolded in fragments, memories piecing together like a puzzle. John had suffered a sudden, severe health crisis, a heart attack that had left him unconscious for days, teetering on the edge of life and death. In the chaos of his emergency, Emily had been the one who stepped in, never once hesitating, never once questioning her own capacity to care for him. She had called for help, of course, but beyond that, she had been his constant companion, nursing him through the worst of it with a devotion that could not be measured by any salary or job description. She had been the one who sat by his side, holding his hand through the long, sleepless nights, whispering words of comfort when he couldn't speak, making sure he ate when he had no appetite, and encouraging him to keep fighting even when his body had given up. Emily had made him the focus of her world, even when he hadn't asked for it, even when he had never truly noticed the quiet strength she had always carried with her. It was only now, in the quiet space of his recovery, that John realized the depth of her sacrifice. She had given up her own time, her own rest, her own life, just to make sure he could have another chance at his own. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself growing closer to Emily in a way he had never imagined. There were no grand gestures or proclamations of love, just small, quiet moments, her soft laughter over a cup of tea, the way she would gently brush the hair from his forehead when he woke, the way she would insist on helping him with even the smallest tasks, though he had never before considered needing her assistance. Each act of care was a revelation, a reminder of the love that had always been there, quietly enduring in the background of his life. Slowly, the walls John had built around himself began to crumble. He began to understand that Emily had never been just a maid, she had been his lifeline, his quiet protector, the one person who had never left, no matter how many times he had taken her for granted. Her love had never been conditional, never tied to any expectation of reward or recognition. She had simply given because she cared, because she wanted him to live, to heal, to grow. For the first time, John felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not only for the physical care Emily had given him, but for the emotional support she had so freely provided, even when he had been blind to it. He had spent so many years focused on his wealth, his power, his achievements, and yet the one thing that had truly mattered, the one thing that had saved his life, had been Emily's quiet love and devotion. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, John looked at Emily with a newfound clarity in his eyes. "I never truly understood what you meant to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled softly, her gaze gentle and understanding. "I didn't do it for recognition," she replied quietly. "I did it because you're worth it. You always have been." Her words, simple yet profound, settled in John's heart like a balm, and for the first time, he felt truly awake, not just to his physical health, but to the deeper truths of his life. Emily had been more than an employee, more than someone who simply worked for him. She had been his family in every way that mattered, showing him that love could exist in the smallest of acts, in the quietest of gestures, and that sometimes, the people who mean the most to us are the ones we take for granted the most. As John continued to heal, he promised himself that he would never again take Emily's presence for granted. He would honor her, not just as the woman who had saved his life, but as the person who had given him a second chance at understanding what truly mattered. In the months that followed, their relationship blossomed into something deeper, built not on grand gestures or titles, but on the quiet bond that had always existed between them, one of love, devotion, and a quiet awakening that changed everything. Tom sat quietly beside his father's hospital bed, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. It had been months since his father's health began to decline, and Tom had watched in helpless silence as the man he once admired, strong, independent, and unyielding, slowly withered away. The days had been filled with hospital visits, late-night phone calls, and endless worry, yet despite all of their efforts, there had been little hope. The doctors had given their grim prognosis, and Tom, consumed by his own fear and helplessness, had resigned himself to the possibility that he would soon lose the person who had been his rock, the person who had shaped his life. It wasn't until Emily came into their lives that things began to shift. Emily, a quiet and compassionate woman, had been hired to care for his father in the hospital, and from the moment she arrived, something began to change. At first, Tom had been skeptical. His father had always been a proud man, never one to accept help easily, let alone from someone who wasn't family. But Emily was different. She wasn't just a caregiver, she was a presence, a calming force that seemed to bring something out of his father that Tom hadn't seen in a long time. It started with small moments, his father's eyes brightening when Emily spoke to him, a faint smile returning to his lips when she gently adjusted his pillow, and the quiet gratitude in his voice when he thanked her for the simplest of things. Emily didn't push him, didn't try to rush his recovery. She simply met him where he was, with patience and kindness, and over time, that patience began to have an effect. Tom couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts. His father, once withdrawn and distant, was now beginning to engage, to fight in ways that Tom hadn't seen before. He was slowly regaining strength, his body responding to the care that Emily provided, but it wasn't just the physical healing that struck Tom. It was the emotional shift, the return of the man his father had once been, a man who still had fight left in him, a man who still had hope. And as the days passed, Tom began to realize something deeper, something that moved him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily wasn't just saving his father physically, she was helping him reclaim his will to live. The days of endless worry began to fade into a quiet sense of relief. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, Tom saw a glimmer of the man his father used to be. He could see it in the way his father laughed at Emily's gentle teasing, in the way he spoke with more life in his voice, in the way his body responded to her care. Emily wasn't just a nurse, she had become a lifeline, a quiet force that had pulled his father from the edge of despair and given him the strength to keep going. One evening, as Tom watched his father sit up in bed, leaning against the pillows with a small smile on his face as Emily spoke to him, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude rise within him. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, he could see everything clearly. Without Emily, he realized, his father might have never come back to life. She had done more than just help him physically recover, she had rekindled the spark of life that had dimmed within him, offering him the kind of care that went beyond medicine. She had given him a reason to fight, a reason to hope, and in doing so, she had not only saved his father but had also saved Tom from the unbearable grief of losing him. The realization hit him like a wave, and his chest tightened with emotion. As he sat there, his father's hand resting gently in Emily's, Tom knew he had to express what he had been holding inside for so long. He turned to Emily, his voice thick with gratitude and raw emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what we would have done without you. You've given my father back to us, you've given him back to me." Emily's eyes softened, and she smiled gently, as though she had been waiting for him to say the words, but Tom could see the depth of her humility. "It's not me," she said softly. "Your father did the hard work. I just helped him get there." But Tom knew better. It wasn't just about his father's will to fight. It was about Emily's presence, her unwavering care, her ability to see his father as more than just a patient. She had seen the man his father once was and had refused to give up on him, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. Her gentle persistence had pulled him from the depths of his illness, and now, as his father sat up in bed, looking more like his old self than he had in months, Tom couldn't help but be overwhelmed with a sense of awe. In the silence that followed, Tom simply nodded, his heart full of gratitude. He didn't know how to repay Emily for what she had done, for the gift of life she had given his father and the peace she had restored to their family. But he knew one thing for certain: she had changed everything. As he sat there, watching the quiet exchange between Emily and his father, Tom felt a deep sense of relief. His father was healing not just physically, but emotionally. And it was all because of the woman who had come into their lives when they needed her most. It wasn't just her skill or her professionalism that had made the difference, it was her compassion, her unwavering belief that his father could recover, and her quiet presence that had made all the difference. Tom knew that, without her, they wouldn't have made it through. And as he looked at her, a quiet sense of peace settled within him. He would never be able to thank her enough, but he would make sure she knew that, in his heart, he was eternally grateful. Tom sat quietly beside his father's hospital bed, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. It had been months since his father's health began to decline, and Tom had watched in helpless silence as the man he once admired, strong, independent, and unyielding, slowly withered away. The days had been filled with hospital visits, late-night phone calls, and endless worry, yet despite all of their efforts, there had been little hope. The doctors had given their grim prognosis, and Tom, consumed by his own fear and helplessness, had resigned himself to the possibility that he would soon lose the person who had been his rock, the person who had shaped his life. It wasn't until Emily came into their lives that things began to shift. Emily, a quiet and compassionate woman, had been hired to care for his father in the hospital, and from the moment she arrived, something began to change. At first, Tom had been skeptical. His father had always been a proud man, never one to accept help easily, let alone from someone who wasn't family. But Emily was different. She wasn't just a caregiver, she was a presence, a calming force that seemed to bring something out of his father that Tom hadn't seen in a long time. It started with small moments: his father's eyes brightening when Emily spoke to him, a faint smile returning to his lips when she gently adjusted his pillow, and the quiet gratitude in his voice when he thanked her for the simplest of things. Emily didn't push him, didn't try to rush his recovery. She simply met him where he was, with patience and kindness, and over time, that patience began to have an effect. Tom couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts. His father, once withdrawn and distant, was now beginning to engage, to fight in ways that Tom hadn't seen before. He was slowly regaining strength, his body responding to the care that Emily provided, but it wasn't just the physical healing that struck Tom. It was the emotional shift, the return of the man his father had once been, a man who still had fight left in him, a man who still had hope. And as the days passed, Tom began to realize something deeper, something that moved him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emily wasn't just saving his father physically, she was helping him reclaim his will to live. The days of endless worry began to fade into a quiet sense of relief. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, Tom saw a glimmer of the man his father used to be. He could see it in the way his father laughed at Emily's gentle teasing, in the way he spoke with more life in his voice, in the way his body responded to her care. Emily wasn't just a nurse, she had become a lifeline, a quiet force that had pulled his father from the edge of despair and given him the strength to keep going. One evening, as Tom watched his father sit up in bed, leaning against the pillows with a small smile on his face as Emily spoke to him, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude rise within him. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, he could see everything clearly. Without Emily, he realized, his father might have never come back to life. She had done more than just help him physically recover, she had rekindled the spark of life that had dimmed within him, offering him the kind of care that went beyond medicine. She had given him a reason to fight, a reason to hope, and in doing so, she had not only saved his father but had also saved Tom from the unbearable grief of losing him. The realization hit him like a wave, and his chest tightened with emotion. As he sat there, his father's hand resting gently in Emily's, Tom knew he had to express what he had been holding inside for so long. He turned to Emily, his voice thick with gratitude and raw emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what we would have done without you. You've given my father back to us, you've given him back to me." Emily's eyes softened, and she smiled gently, as though she had been waiting for him to say the words, but Tom could see the depth of her humility. "It's not me," she said softly. "Your father did the hard work. I just helped him get there." But Tom knew better. It wasn't just about his father's will to fight. It was about Emily's presence, her unwavering care, her ability to see his father as more than just a patient. She had seen the man his father once was and had refused to give up on him, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. Her gentle persistence had pulled him from the depths of his illness, and now, as his father sat up in bed, looking more like his old self than he had in months, Tom couldn't help but be overwhelmed with a sense of awe. In the silence that followed, Tom simply nodded, his heart full of gratitude. He didn't know how to repay Emily for what she had done, for the gift of life she had given his father and the peace she had restored to their family. But he knew one thing for certain, she had changed everything. As he sat there, watching the quiet exchange between Emily and his father, Tom felt a deep sense of relief. His father was healing not just physically, but emotionally. And it was all because of the woman who had come into their lives when they needed her most. It wasn't just her skill or her professionalism that had made the difference, it was her compassion, her unwavering belief that his father could recover, and her quiet presence that had made all the difference. Tom knew that, without her, they wouldn't have made it through. And as he looked at her, a quiet sense of peace settled within him. He would never be able to thank her enough, but he would make sure she knew that, in his heart, he was eternally grateful.